Thank you everyone for joining me and my financial services colleagues for today's roundtable on the barriers and discrimination that older Americans and people with disabilities face in trying to remain in their homes. I want to thank the Financial Services Committee and Chairwoman Maxine Waters for facilitating this event, and for all of my colleagues who were able to join today. This is an issue that I care deeply about. We often take for granted what it means to have a home. Where we can comfortably live and go about our daily activities without much trouble. But for far too many older Americans or people with disabilities in our community, our country's housing stock doesn't offer the same comfort. We also have a rental affordability problem that is a challenge for so many Americans, but is a special challenge for older Americans and those with disabilities, many of whom live on fixed incomes that might not even cover the cost of rent for a modest one-bedroom apartment. Federal rental assistance helps 10.4 million people afford their homes, and 41% of those people are seniors or people with disabilities. But there are more than twice as many who get help don't get help. Today, there are 23 million people who qualify for rental assistance, but are left to languish on waiting lists while paying unaffordable rents. And what this means when they're not able to have an affordable rent is they have less money to be able to pay for nutritious food, to be able to cover essential healthcare costs like prescription medicine, or even to set aside money for a rainy day. Housing affordability is not the only challenge. Many Americans who are older or who have disabilities require homes that accommodate mobility issues. Accessible housing means that these individuals and families can remain in their homes and receive community-based care instead of having to go to group homes or institutional settings. Most Americans want to be able to age in their homes, but for many, that's simply not an option. An analysis from the Housing and Urban Development HUD in 2011 using national data found that less than 1% of the US housing stock was wheelchair accessible, while only about 1/3 of homes could even be modified so that they would be wheelchair accessible. And as our country's population continues to age, we need to do more to make sure that our housing is going to meet the needs of our seniors and people with disabilities. We also have to make sure that we're creating housing opportunities that are truly integrated into our communities. Too frequently, people with disabilities face wait lists for non-group housing that is fully integrated into the local community. This gives them the ability to live, work, and receive voluntary support in their own homes, tailored to meet their needs. And so when they're forced to live in a congregate setting like a group home, there can be restrictions on their basic rights, like when they can leave the facility or when visitors are allowed. And staying in their own homes allows them to have the least restrictive environment and have maximum quality of life. And this is also an issue of compliance, not just with fair housing principles, but also with the Americans with Disability Act, which is celebrating its 30th anniversary this year. Housing discrimination also exacerbates the lack of housing options for people with disabilities. According to the National Fair Housing Alliance, discrimination on the basis of disability made up more than 56%. That is more than half of all reported housing discrimination complaints in 2018. And again, so we have to do more to make sure that the housing industry is complying with the law to give everyone an equal opportunity for housing, including those with disabilities. I'm looking forward to today's conversation with our panelists. In particular, I'm interested to hear how HUD has responded to the COVID-19 pandemic to protect seniors and people with disabilities who are living in federally assisted housing. So thank you again to the Financial Services Committee for hosting this, to my colleagues for joining me, and I'd like to welcome our panelists, and then we'll get started. First, we have joining us Linda Couch. Linda is the Vice President of Housing Policy at LeadingAge, an advocacy group for aging Americans. Linda works closely with thought leaders and federal agencies, particularly the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, on examining and advocating for LeadingAge's housing policy goals. Next, we have Sara Pratt. Sara is a fair housing and civil rights attorney at Relman Colfax. She was previously the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Fair Housing Enforcement at HUD, where she also directed their national civil rights enforcement efforts. We also have Allison Donald. She's an independent living specialist at the Memphis Center for Independent Living. She's a community organizer and activist for the disability community, where she uses her own experience living with cerebral palsy to help others become more independent in their own lives. And last, I'm really proud to introduce a constituent of the 45th Congressional District, Kelsey Brewer. She is the Communications and Policy Manager at Jamboree Housing Corporation. This is the largest nonprofit developer of affordable and supportive housing in Orange County. And there, Kelsey helps build relationships with like-minded external groups and helps tell the story, the Jamboree story of how they meet the needs of those who need supportive and specialized housing. So with that, we'll turn it over to the committee to recognize the panelists.
Congresswoman Porter, if you would like to continue on, I think you're doing an excellent job.
Okay, do we have Ms. Couch here?
I am here.
Wonderful. Ms. Couch, could you give us your opening remarks, please?
Sure, thank you. It'd be easy to paint a picture of a well-to-do aging America, but it would be false. The lowest income older adults are the same or worse off than they were a decade ago, while the wealthiest are wealthier. Homeownership rates have a lot to do with wealth among older adults, which, as this committee well knows, are vastly different for white households than Black households. The lowest income quartile of older adult renters, according to Harvard, has an average net wealth of $1,100. The lowest income quartile of older adult homeowners has an average net wealth of $104,000. Older adults are not a cohesive bunch. Like other groups, they represent the gamut of needs. Earlier this summer, HUD posted a new report, Worst Case Housing Needs 2019 report, to Congress. You have a worst case housing needs if you are a very low income renter who's spending more than half of your income on housing, or you're living in severely inadequate housing. Nationally, the overall number of households with worst case housing needs declined by 7% between 2015 and 2017, but it increased among older adults by 4%. The report attributes this increase in worst case needs to the growing population of very low income older adult renter households. But we challenge this really flip reasoning. Perhaps the real blame rests not on older adults aging, but in our failure as a nation to prepare for the surge in older adult households known to be coming for decades. In the greater Los Angeles area, for example, more than 1/4 of 65+ households pay more than half of their incomes for their housing costs. And according to Harvard, older adults paying more than half of their incomes for housing are also spending 53% less on food and 50% less on health than their non-housing cost burden peers. The rent eats first. Meanwhile, homelessness among older adults is rising faster than the nation is aging. Fortunately, the most successful solutions are well known and immediately available when provided sufficient resources. Expanding the supply of affordable housing, preserving as much existing currently affordable housing as possible. An entitlement to housing assistance for certain populations is another very straightforward solution. Only 1 of every 3 eligible older adult households currently receives housing assistance. LeadingAge represents more than 5,000 aging-focused organizations. Our members, by and large, have very long waiting lists for affordable housing, from 2 to several years long. Our federal response to "I need help" is get in line and wait a very, very long time. Congress, even under the assistance strangling budget caps that will finally end next year, has found its way to revive funding for new production via HUD's flagship senior housing program, the Section 202 program. Unfortunately, HUD has only released 20% of the funds Congress has charged it with administering since 2017 for new Section 202 homes. This committee has supported significant expansion of HUD's 202 program to help meet the affordable housing needs of older adults, and LeadingAge is deeply grateful for your leadership. We're particularly grateful for the attention this committee, specifically you, Congresswoman Porter, Chair Waters, for introducing HR 6873, which will help address the role of HUD's privately owned, federally subsidized senior housing communities in preventing the spread of COVID among very low income, predominantly non-white seniors. The bill would not only provide COVID relief dollars to complement the funds provided by the CARES Act in March, which HUD is yet to distribute to Section 202 providers, but also recognizes the role service coordinators and wireless internet have in making senior apartment communities the places they need to be for wellness and social connection. And in addition to affordability and housing providers' ability to respond to the pandemic, another area, as just mentioned by Congresswoman Porter, that is hampering older adults' ability to age with choice is the physical adequacy of their homes. We have a very piecemeal, haphazard patchwork of home modification programs that help a limited number of older adults make their homes more physically suitable to their needs as they age in community. A staggeringly low share of owned and rented homes today have even basic accessibility features. We need to do much more and much better in this area. We look forward to today's conversation, and we thank you for holding this roundtable.
Katie, you're still on mute.
Ms. Couch, for your remarks. I now recognize Sara Pratt for her opening remarks.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this roundtable. I'm here probably because I have been involved in enforcing fair housing laws for many years and worked at HUD twice. That does not mean I explain nor justify some of the things that HUD does, so don't blame me for everything that HUD has done over the years. I will just say I will talk a little bit about HUD programs and issues a little bit later in my remarks. I want to start my presentation by saying to you, I've lived the issues that you're talking about today. My first act when I was a young married woman was to find an accessible apartment where my husband and I could live. My husband, Charlie Pratt, was getting a master's degree in urban planning, and he used a wheelchair, and I was in law school. We had a terrible time finding anywhere we could live that was a decent housing opportunity. We spent 2 years in a 221D3 property where we were at least 40 years younger than any other resident in the property because that's where we could find an accessible unit. We were turned down by other HUD-supported housing because they had too many wheelchairs there already. When we were no longer eligible for HUD funding, we rented a market rate unit and built our own ramp and took the bathroom door off the hinges so it could be usable to us. When we finally could afford to buy a house, we had the additional cost of paying an architect to design and have built a ramp so that our house in a sweet little neighborhood could be accessible and beautiful simultaneously. The cost of living with someone with a disability and just providing accessible features to allow that person to use and really live fully in their housing is really a significant barrier to people with disabilities, even those that are trying to move through an upward trajectory. I support and agree with everything that Linda said, but I want to talk a little bit about the need for increases in accessible housing stock. Accessible housing is really needed for people with disabilities to live in neighborhoods in all kinds of housing, affordable housing and market rate housing, in small neighborhood-based group homes consistent with the Americans with Disabilities Act, Title II for people with all kinds of disabilities. The idea of warehousing people with disabilities and or including as sort of as an afterthought, people with disabilities in senior housing is no longer a solution for the most integrated environment setting that we look for. Housing needs to be available for people with vouchers and without vouchers. Project-based vouchers provide a new approach that can expand housing stock that will serve people with disabilities, including people with mental disabilities, but you still have the challenges of having enough accessible housing in the single-family market and in the multifamily or apartment and condo markets that will actually serve people. I spent a ton of my life trying to enforce the Fair Housing Act's accessibility requirements. I'm representing clients in 3 such cases right now. Although Congress amended the Fair Housing Act to require construction of accessible multifamily housing in 1988, that effort is still a struggle to get the housing to comply and to make it known to people with disabilities. It's important that people not continue living in nursing homes or in institutions or in jam-packed 202 properties where everyone who lives there has a disability, but to have the choice of living in neighborhoods and in smaller residential settings. And yet that is the place where the accessible housing stock is the most lacking. Many cities, including Los Angeles and Chicago, have taken HUD money, community development block grant money, and they have failed, they've built housing with it, but they have failed to ensure that that housing comply with accessibility requirements. My firm has sued the city of Los Angeles over this issue, and it is suing the city of Chicago on this issue right now. That's a lot of tax money lost that is not being able to provide accessibility. Also, because of cutbacks in fair housing enforcement activities and in compliance work particularly, HUD is either through its program areas or through the Office of Fair Housing is not able to have the resources to either do a robust education program about accessibility and how to assure it, and they don't have the money to do a back-end compliance oversight program either, even on programs like RAD, which is a housing generation program that really needs to be sure to provide accessible housing as it's being constructed. So in particular, RAD, CDBG, and home funds, there's a lack of housing stock. And I'll end, but I want to call out one specific issue, and that is the need for construction of accessible single-family housing through the home program primarily, but also through other programs. HUD Section 504 regulations and the Fair Housing Act do not require single-family housing to be made accessible routinely. And I am a strong supporter of requiring at least 10% of single family houses, which are in neighborhoods by definition, to be required to be fully accessible to serve people with disabilities, including housing with 3 and 4 bedrooms. I thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer questions in a few minutes.
Thank you so much, Ms. Pratt. I'd now like to recognize Ms. Allison Donald for her opening remarks.
Good afternoon, and thank you to the Financial Services Committee for hosting this very important conversation. My name is Allison Donald, and like Ms. Pratt, this conversation is very personal to me because not only do I work in the disability rights sector, I'm also a person who is living with a disability. And for me and the work that I've done, I can say that finding an affordable, accessible, integrated housing remains the #1 barrier for people living with disabilities to truly achieve the independence that we all seek to achieve. And to piggyback off of what Ms. Pratt said a little bit earlier, one of the major issues that we have seen is with these community development and block grants. They have taken that money and they have built up these beautiful townhomes, but what people don't realize is that under the law, townhomes are not made are not required to be accessible. So that locks a lot of people out who have disabilities of even obtaining those type of homes, even in affordable neighborhoods and affordable living situations. And for people who choose or are coming out of a nursing home who are forced to live in congregate living settings, those situations are a revolving door, in my opinion, because once you find yourself in that situation, you are oftentimes overcharged for the substandard living conditions that you are subjected to, because you only, at times, I know here in Memphis specifically, you only have a certain amount of money, and the majority of that money is going to your living expenses, mainly your rent. For me, the staggering number of people who have been put out on the street. Well, I don't know if you all know the 1135 waiver, which allows, nursing home and rehab facilities to house patients until they find a suitable place to live. That, because of COVID-19, that has been waived now. So a staggering number of people are being thrown being thrown into homelessness without places to go, because we now are part of a housing market that is not only aging, but is also not, the housing that we have is not accessible. A lot of the times I have found that it's the 3 times the rent rule, the rent restrictions that landlords place on properties that have locked people out of access to obtain homes. And I'm hoping with this conversation that we can address this going forward and keep that at the forefront of the conversation. I know Senator Elizabeth Warren presented a bill earlier this year to address that when she was running for her president, when she was running during her presidential campaign. So I'm very interested to see how, you are going forward, Representative Porter, and how the other members of this committee plan on going forward with some of the legislation that is going to be presented, here.
Thank you so much, Ms. Donald. I really appreciate your remarks. And we're now going to recognize our final witness, Ms. Kelsey Brewer.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Porter. My name is Kelsey Brewer, and I serve as the Communications and Policy Manager for Jamboree Housing Corporation. Since 1990, Jamboree has been building for good throughout California. We've been developing affordable, quality housing and supportive housing with resident services that create strong and healthy communities that transform lives and neighborhoods. And as a mission-driven nonprofit community development organization, Jamboree has engaged in dozens of successful cross-sector partnerships to develop more than 9,000 units of affordable and supportive housing. And I'm happy to say that even with all of the chaos of COVID, we have thousands more in our development pipeline. We're familiar with the various state and federal resources available for the financing and construction of affordable and supportive housing. And as I'm sure this committee knows, the low-income housing tax credit has been a primary driver of affordable and supportive housing development for seniors and people with disabilities. 28.7% of housing credit units are set aside for seniors. 5.3% of housing credit units are set aside for people with disabilities. And more than 31% of all housing credit units across the nation have a senior head of household, and roughly 12% of housing credit units have at least one member reported as disabled. Increased funding to the low-income housing tax credit and regulatory changes like creating and establishing a 4% credit floor would immediately fill the critical financing gaps for developments that are hanging in the balance for financial feasibility. And this would dramatically increase the supply of desperately needed housing, something that we've heard echoed many times here today. But again, this group knows well the importance of the housing credit and what changes need to be made to make it more effective. What I really want to drive home today is the intersection of federal investment and the individual resident experience. Developers don't typically talk about things like services and resident experience. Without regulation, some may not even offer services at their sites. But Jamboree is different. We view housing as a platform for service delivery. What happens inside of our communities is just as important as the physical infrastructure of these developments. It's partly because we're a nonprofit, longtime owner of our communities. When we build senior housing and housing for people with disabilities, it's not just for the 15-year regulatory period. It's for 55 years plus, and our resident team and our corporate team is just as much a part of the community as our residents are. For our seniors, not only do we support their financial needs through affordable housing, but we also work to connect them to the benefit programs like Medicare and CalFresh to ensure that the government social safety net is fully deployed around them. But seniors are more than the numbers and metrics that we sometimes attach to them, and our service model recognizes that. By providing on-site and accessible resident services with program elements that encourage social engagement and address resident concerns, Jamboree has seen a measured decrease in social isolation and loneliness for seniors living in our communities, which leads to better long-term physical outcomes and mental health outcomes for our seniors. In short, these outcomes assure that our residents are going to age in place longer, which ought to be the goal of all senior housing. The pillars of our service model focus on promoting the social and economic well-being of our seniors, as well as promoting opportunities for lifelong learning, education, and civic engagement. Our supportive housing communities take a similar approach to resident services. Seeing our residents thrive for the long term is at the center of everything that we do. At our supportive housing communities, residents typically have either a physical disability, a mental health diagnosis, or sometimes both. People living with disabilities, whether physical or mental health or mental related, are at an increased risk of experiencing homelessness and typically have less stable housing situations. And without stable housing, it's nearly impossible to achieve good health and positive educational outcomes. And that's why our service model focuses on empowering residents to live more productive and stable lives while maintaining housing. That may sound simple, but it involves a combination of housing first best practices, utilization of the harm reduction approach, most motivational interviewing, and intensive case management services that address the social determinants of health. I wanted to give you this context today of what goes on inside of our communities that serve seniors and people living with disabilities, because Jamboree firmly believes that meeting the housing needs of these populations isn't just about addressing the capital and financing needs of development and construction costs. Currently, there isn't really a regulatory obligation for Jamboree to provide any of the services that I just discussed, except for the 9% credit. And even then, those services are incredibly limited. Sure, there is a regulatory obligation to provide services on paper for most federal and state funding sources, but most of them go unfunded or underfunded depending on the underwriting of a project and other requirements. But Jamboree communities are different. We consistently incorporate the cost of resident services above the line in our performance, meaning that it's built into the deal. But what I want to stress today is that an individual organization's business practices shouldn't impact whether seniors and people living with disabilities have access to both quality housing and quality services. By providing additional funding for the operational costs of these communities, we can effectively create a federal standard of care for some of our most vulnerable groups. One of our core values is that the communities we build must be more than shelter. We aspire to help create safe and nurturing and cohesive communities for people living with disabilities and our senior population. And what we want our residents to be able to know is not only the safety of housing, but the dignity of home. Thank you again for your time today, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Ms. Brewer. Before we begin with our panelist questions, I'd like to recognize our distinguished chairwoman of the Financial Services Committee, a champion for accessible and affordable housing for all, Chairwoman Maxine Waters, for opening remarks.
Well, thank you very much. First, let me commend you for putting together this roundtable today. This is very, very important. And as we deal with the housing issues in our committee, we must remember to be focused on housing for seniors, for the disabled. And this roundtable is going to help us to put more attention on these areas that I think perhaps we needed to put more attention on. So I'm very appreciative for that. Let me just say, Ms. Porter, that I want to raise a question about supportive services. What I'm hearing is that there needs to be more resources, or we really do need to rethink not only providing brick and mortar and places for people to live, but we really do need to think more about supportive services the way we think about supportive services for the homeless. Am I hearing that there needs to be new programming, there needs to be additional resources, and more thought going into what we do with the disabled in particular, as it relates to HUD's responsibility? And so, Ms. Porter, let me just say to you, who put a lot of time and attention on this issue, that I would like to, have some response, to that question, because while I came in a little bit late, I think mostly what I've heard about is supportive services and the lack of. Is that true? Is that something that we have really missed as a committee in the way that we should have been paying attention to it? Is this something that we need to create some new programming for? Please, if you will allow your guests who are here today to continue to give more information on that and to speak to what those needs are, I would appreciate it very much. So with that, thank you for allowing me some opening statement remarks. I yield back the balance of my time to you.
Thank you so much. And actually, I think what we'll do is go ahead and recognize Ms. Brewer to start to flesh out what the chairwoman's asking about. What could the committee do? I think one of the things you said is that these services often go unfunded or underfunded. Developers focus on the cost of construction. That's how they build their financing. And because of that, after the property goes up, residents don't receive supportive housing. Can you talk a little bit? I've had the privilege of touring your Doria project right here in Irvine and seeing the kinds of supportive services. Could you tell the chairwoman and the committee a little bit about when we say supportive services, can you be concrete about what kinds of things you provide, and then talk about how that makes a difference in people's longevity and how in the way that the supportive housing fits into the neighborhood and community, and then make a policy recommendation for us on how we can correct this to make sure that we're not just putting up, as you said, not just building housing, but creating homes.
Wow, that is a very large question. So I'm going to take it in a couple different parts, but I'll start with what Congresswoman Porter mentioned, which was Doria, which is one of our supportive housing sites. And, when we talk about supportive services, I think a lot of times what people think about is the idea of we have a person on site that does programming like you do at a market rate housing, maybe there's parties and things like that. But when we're talking about supportive services for extremely vulnerable populations that we know we need to keep housed, the supportive services take a much more aggressive role. So, at Jamboree, we have an entire division dedicated to this. This is our community impact team. And what that team does is create individualized resident service plans for communities. So that involves addressing the needs of the surrounding community. So the example that I can give you is we have a property in Northern Orange County that's intergenerational. It serves both seniors and families. And one of the things that we did when we went to build Wesley Village was talk to the surrounding neighborhoods about what lack of services were in the neighborhood. And then we actually built that space into our properties. So that includes on-site clinics, a Head Start program for youth, and things like that. But I want to emphasize that all of those things are, again, things that Jamboree builds into the deal. We go after and get additional funding or supply for it for ourselves to fund those types of programs. There is not really a dedicated federal stream of funding. So one of the first recommendations that I would make is when evaluating permanent supportive housing, and as that population begins to grow and age, we know that there's going to be healthcare issues. Jamboree, Orange County United Way, and the University of California, Irvine sponsored a study that showed that housing folks leads to better outcomes that are more cost effective. So one of the things that I would recommend that this committee look at is how do we align the investments that the federal government is making into programs like Medicare or Medi-Cal here in California and aligning that with the housing goals of these populations. Because instead of providing those healthcare-based services through the property financing, it could be complemented by aligning federal resources. So that would be one piece that I would recommend. And then the second piece that I would be is I definitely think that there's conversations that can be had with the private sector on this. I was recently staffing my president and CEO, Laura Archuleta, on a panel today with the California Housing Consortium. She was leading a panel talking with different lenders from across the state about how COVID-19 is impacting the way that they're looking at these deals, underwriting these projects. And they raised the flag on that call saying that we are starting to look more closely at permanent supportive housing sites. We're starting to look more closely at how you fund these services, because during good times when everything's going great and everyone's paying their rent, maybe we can figure out a way to pay for those services. But as credit tightens and all of those different things tighten, without a dedicated funding stream, lenders are starting to get concerned about the long-term financial feasibility of these projects.
Thank you
If
very
I
much.
could jump in too to talk about older adults and services. Most seniors as they age will need some type of help to age in community, to age where they want to live, which is usually, as you've said, in their homes. And about half of HUD Section 202 communities have a service coordinator, and these are people who link seniors to services and supports in the community, not just entitlement programs, but specific kinds of doctors and health programs, reminding them to keep their relationships up with their primary care physicians. And those service coordinators, where they exist in those communities, have been shown, there's been a lot of research on this, have been shown to decrease emergency room visits, increase primary care visits, and improve residents' health. And so I think in the HUD world, not in the tax credit world, but in the HUD world, we do have a HUD-funded salary position in the service coordinator, but there are only service coordinators in about half of 202s. And we don't have those similar sort of positions where there are tons of other seniors and tons of other people with disabilities, like public housing and the broader the larger HUD programs beyond the Section 202 program. And the permanent supportive housing is one, as Kelsey said, very aggressive, service-enriched housing model. But probably that in PSH really helps people, say, who are coming off the street, who are at high risk of living on the street. And probably the vast majority of people who just need affordable housing, but also want to age in community and not in an institution, they need a home and they need a service coordinator who's going to help them connect to things that they need to connect with as their needs change. And then lastly, I'll say the big difference, one of the big differences besides funding that service coordinator role, which the 202 program does, is that it ensures that the seniors who are living in those programs, like other HUD programs do, public housing, HUD programs differ greatly from the tax credit program in that rents are always affordable and that incomes can be as low as zero and people can still afford to live in those homes. And many states and many organizations go to great lengths to make tax credit housing affordable for extremely low-income people. But HUD-assisted programs like public housing, Section 8, 202, 811, every household's rent is affordable to that household, even as that household's rent fluctuates, which brings a whole other level of benefit to that resident's housing stability as they seek to bring their lives forward. And lastly, I'll mention that, we totally agree, we need to get Medicare and Medicaid on the table. There has to be some sort of a new financing model for services that brings services into these communities. The fact that we've got, 20,000 HUD affordable housing communities, and they're right there, they're sitting right in front of us, and we don't have a way to fund services in them that people of all ages need, is really a huge disconnect. And I really think that if, the committee were to take that on and really force HHS, CMS to come to the table on a financing model that is community-based, would be tremendously beneficial to the whole country.
Thank you, Ms. Porter, very much.
Thank you so much. Chairwoman Waters, if you have any additional questions, you are now recognized.
No, thank you very much. I think my concern has been answered, and I learned a lot just in this short period of time about the lack of comprehensive supportive services for the disability clients that are in these properties. That's revealing. Thank you. And I'm sure that as we talk about how to deal with this, we can come up with some answers. Thank you so much, Ms. Porter.
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters. Next, we'll go to Mr. Porter, who's now recognized, Mr. Perlmutter, sorry, for his questions.
Thank you. I really just have one question or one area that I'd like to ask about, and that was Ms. Pratt. You brought up the need to have accessible housing in single-family homes, and you wanted it to be 10% of new single-family homes be accessible. Can you give us some examples of where you have subdivisions or developments where there is accessibility for seniors and disabled in single-family communities, and what you think this might end up costing us, and what are kind of the pluses and minuses? Please.
Is that HUD funded single-family houses, not regular market rate single-family houses, but HUD funded single-family houses, which are constructed these days mostly under the HOME program, which is a community development program, which allows the construction of new single-family houses and multifamily, that those single-family houses, at least 10% of them be made to be accessible and required to be accessible as part of the construction planning. So the cost associated, if any, with making them accessible would be borne by the federal government and the programs that Congress funds. That's because although we have some visitability programs around the country to increase visitability in some kinds of units, the market right now for accessible single-family housing, to the extent there is one in market rate units, is consumer driven. It tends to be higher end. I might live in one myself, right? It's a single family retirement community in Delaware. I was so pleased. Here I am. It's got one step up to the front door, master on the main, all the things that go with a more usable function. But I think that the first step is to make the affordable housing choices that we have in home ownership, to make those much more accessible to people with disabilities than they currently are. And I would start there and then move in a more robust fashion to incentivize developers to continue to develop accessible housing for the broader market. But I don't think the first step should be making all single-family housing accessible.
Okay, just my last question to kind of piggyback off that answer. Are you familiar with any, goes beyond HUD, so I know, and I'll apologize for spreading this farther, but local governments in their development permitting processes, are you aware of any that demand that some portion of the houses in a particular development have accessibility for seniors or for disabled?
So, no, I am not aware of such a situation. There are a number of local communities that encourage or mandate visitability in some types of housing, mostly in multi-story townhouses where the first ground floor unit has to be usable by people with disabilities. Those requirements vary quite a bit from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and essentially it's driven by a grassroots effort, but I'm not aware of such requirements for single-family housing.
Okay, thank you very much for your testimony. I yield back.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to Mr. Heck for his questions.
Thank you. I would invite the panelists to take a look at a bill I've introduced. Panelists would not know this, but I'm headed for the pasture, namely I'm retiring, and this bill isn't going to get passed this year in all likelihood, but it's entitled Fulfilling the Promise of the National Housing Trust Fund. And what it would do is take the 10 basis point G fee that was adopted by Congress to pay for the payroll tax cut back in 2011 and divert it all to the construction of affordable housing. As it currently is written, I don't believe there's an accessibility component, but I think that's a really cool idea. And, you know, part of the issue of providing for expanded accessibility is where we're going to get the money. This is a 100% painless way to get the money because it's a fee that's being paid now. Nobody will experience literally a red cent increase in cost over what we do now. The G fee is scheduled to expire next year, I believe at the end of September. We need to grab it for affordable housing because we have a housing crisis writ large, and we clearly have a housing crisis vis-a-vis accessibility. Nobody will pay any more than they do right now. So if we're ever going to get serious about dealing with the housing crisis, including accessibility, we got to figure out a way to fund it. And this is literally a 100% painless way to fund it. So I think the number is $55.99, but I would invite you to look at it and get back in touch with our office. Ask for Rena if you've got ideas on how we might incorporate meeting accessibility needs, and have that be a part at least of the conversation prior to next year. And I hope you all would consider, in fact, giving us some suggestions on how we might do that and being a part of the coalition that I hope will emerge to actually get this job done, even when I am gone, because this is a really big need. And it seems to me there's a way here we can make common cause for the good of a lot of people. So I don't really have a question, just a suggestion, and I thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you, Mr. Heck. We'll now go to Mr. San Nicolas for his questions.
Thank you so much. And I wanted to open by extending a extreme gratitude to Congresswoman Porter for putting this together. You know, over the course of my short time in the Congress, I find so many things that are opportune and yet unrealized, particularly for my district, the territory of Guam. And in preparation for this hearing, Ms. Porter, we reached out to HUD, and I think you would be surprised to find out that we have 0 Section 811 and 0 Section 202 facilities on Guam. There's absolutely nothing available, and that is on top of the fact that supplemental security income, SSI, also does not apply to Guam. So you can imagine how our communities with disabilities are incredibly underserved by the lack of these programs and resources having been realized in the territory. And so I just wanted to extend my thanks to you for highlighting this issue. I wanted to extend my thanks to panelists for their very enlightening contribution to today's discussion. I'm particularly interested, Ms. Porter, if you can help, again, the same way you helped us with pointing us into the direction for rental assistance that Irvine was putting together. I know that you mentioned that on a call several months back, and I did take you up on that. Find ways to have the existing nonprofit infrastructure, such as Jamboree housing, to be able to reach out to other underserved areas to create the nonprofit infrastructure necessary for us to not only avail of Section 811 and Section 202 resources, but to also have almost a community of nonprofits kind of lifting up the service standard, so we can have things as excellent as what Jamboree has been describing here today. I also wanted to put on the record for the committee that I think it would be a good idea for members to and for the committee to organize, when these COVID circumstances abate, the opportunity for us to go and see firsthand the differences between what is out there and what we have come to think is the norm. I think all of these things are fantastic opportunities for us to get the senior and disability community housing challenges right. And I just wanted to express all of that and look forward to working with you, Congresswoman Porter, and with my colleagues on this call, and with that we address this very, very acute need in the right way. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Thank you so much. Next, we'll go to Mr. Caston for his questions.
Thank you. Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you, Congresswoman Porter, for pulling this together. I have a question for Ms. Brewer from a comment you made, and maybe you were just being illustrative, which is fine, but I don't want to let it slip. You had raised a concern in response to one of the early questions about, if I heard you right, about rising yield spreads in the financing of these homes. Are you seeing, as we look at, obviously interest rates overall are going down. Are you seeing rising borrowing costs as you look to finance these facilities?
Well, yes and no. I think that we're still trying to, and the lending market is still trying to, anticipate how the rest of the kind of shocks to our economy are going to play out. I know one of the things that we're continuing to look at to, determine the feasibility of these projects moving forward is rental payments. Depending on the type of project, if it's a project-based project, if there's a dedicated revenue stream to it, or if it's based off of rental income, it changes kind of the volatility of the project. So what I would say from the conversations that we're hearing from lenders, it's not necessarily about raising borrowing rates going up, but just more critically looking at how the project pencils out. Because remember, when we talk about the low-income housing tax credit program, and we talk about that kind of built-in public-private partnerships of nonprofits like Jamboree working with, large corporations, large banks, it doesn't give a guarantee that a project will be funded just because it pencils out. The lender is going to go in and look at the unit mix. The lender is going to go in and look at all of those different factors. And as we continue to see the effects of the economic downturn on the markets, what the lenders are telling us is we're going to be looking more closely at these permanent supportive housing projects, not because on the capital side, there's a lot of capital for the actual physical construction of these facilities, but the ongoing operating costs of what actually makes the facility successful. Housing without supportive services for these incredibly chronic and vulnerable populations is not successful. So where the concern from the lenders is coming from is how do we address that gap in revenue strain on the operational and service side, if that makes sense?
So how do you typically finance those ongoing funds? Is that out of working capital? Do you get revolvers? Does that just have to be funded out of operating cash flow?
It's a combination of both. Yes.
Okay. And when you're building these facilities, what is there a typical sort of percent debt financing, or is it all over the board?
You know, I would have to talk specifically to my development team, but I'm happy to follow up with the staff and get the actual specific split on that for you, Congressman.
Okay. Well, the specifics, and it may be a moot issue, but one of the, as we're sitting here looking at this global economic downturn, one would presume that we're going to see rising spreads, particularly for those, those categories of investments that are a little bit more uncertain that they're going to be able to repay. And so the nature of my question is sort of what should we be, as I listened to a lot of your introductory remarks was talking about we should have seen this coming because we knew we had an aging population. Well, as we look forward right now, it seems to me that we can see coming some challenges in the riskier ends of debt markets, even as we can probably also see coming really cheap money for people like the United States, who at least so far have a history of not defaulting. And so if there are metrics that we should be watching to think about where there might be some gaps we can see coming, welcome your thoughts.
I have a lot of really smart people on the Jamboree business development and finance team. In fact, I can see my phone blowing up. They're starting to message me all the things they'd like me to say. So what I will do is I will follow up with your staff with that specific question, because I'm sure we have some recommendations. But, the broader kind of thematic theme of your question about preparing for these things, I can just speak to Orange County. Our population, our homeless population, the average age is steadily increasing. And that just increases all of those kind of compounding effects on healthcare and on housing risk. And so, as we think about how we kind of address that graying population, I think it needs to not only be about new funding streams, because that's absolutely something that we need, but also how do we align these federal programs that are touching all of these different vulnerable populations, but aren't necessarily communicating to each other to achieve the goal of healthy, safe, sustainable housing for seniors and people with disabilities.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Could I add just one additional point to that very well taken point by Kelsey, and that is that the alignment of the funds is really important because not all supportive services need to be provided at apartments. Sometimes, especially in our post-Olmsted world where people with disabilities are living in single-family houses throughout a community, services need to be delivered to people in their homes rather than in nursing homes. And so when you're thinking about supportive service delivery, we ought to have a continuum of opportunities and not just always tie it to supportive housing. So that's a friendly amendment to Ms. Brewer's comments.
May I add something to this conversation to piggyback off of what Ms. Pratt said and as well as Ms. Brewer? There is a substantial savings that will happen once we are able to, number one, identify the person who needs the housing. Number two, what type of services and supports they need in their own community versus providing those same services and supports in a nursing home type of facility. And I think like Ms. Pratt said, I think there is some education that needs to happen, especially in regards to, fulfilling the promise of the Olmsted Act, which is, one of the most important pieces of legislation for a person living with a disability and anyone working in this sector, because it is the law that underpins the ADA and says it is a must that people with disabilities and our aging population be afforded the choice to live in an integrated and affordable setting of their choice. So hopefully there is an education component built into the work that is going to be done. And there is, I forget the law, but there are statistics out there that tell you that if a new construction is built after 1990, I believe there is a certain percentage that is supposed to be affordable and accessible and integrated. The problem is, I know for Memphis, they took the CBGD funds and they built it under the guise of making this affordable, accessible, and integrated housing, and they charge market rate rent for it. So that is an issue as well. Enforcing the homestead, like I said, in that education, and also understanding what true accessibility means for each person with a disability, because people's disabilities are different and they manifest themselves in different ways. And also understanding that even if a person right now in the midst of this COVID pandemic, the 1135 waiver that was used to keep people in nursing facilities and hospitals while their housing was being arranged, that is gone. So what we need to focus on, and what we have been focused on, particularly here in Memphis and Tennessee overall, is helping people understand that this way, just because COVID-19 is going on doesn't mean they have the right to put you out on the street. And if this is happening, this is what you do. And understanding that if you find yourself in a experiencing homeless and end up in a homeless facility, then you can also receive their services and support that way. And it's important that we start building that pipeline to help people understand, services and support are not just tied to facility or facility living. They can also be tied to living out in your community and understanding how to develop those community resources. Because the goal ultimately for us in my particular line of work is to allow the person to have the choice to live where they want to. And that's all I wanted to add.
Yeah, there's simply no way to fulfill Olmsted without a lot more affordable housing and connection, whatever that looks like, to services. Right now, hospitals have contracts and leases and agreements with shelters, and that is the discharge plan. And they're renting rooms and numbers of beds, and that is completely unacceptable. I think we would all agree, right? But what we need is more affordable housing. We need more flexibility. We need more accessible housing. And until we have those things, any community's drive to comply with Olmsted, to provide real choice to people, and strong fair housing laws won't be achievable.
Thank you so much. Next, we'll go to Ms. Porter for her questions.
Yes, I wanted to ask a follow-up question. Ms. Couch, in your remarks, you mentioned that HUD has only released about 20% of Section 202 funding. And I wanted to ask you to elaborate a little bit on what explain Section 202 housing to everyone who might be watching, if you could. And then if you could talk a little bit about what tools we might use to prompt HUD to take that action. And I'd like to hear from Ms. Pratt as well about the need for enforcement. We funded this and it's not happening. And so that's about accountability and oversight, which is one of my passions. So I would love to hear from you first, Ms. Couch, and then from Ms. Pratt.
Great. The 202 program is very similar in many, many ways to the HUD's 811 program. The program exists as funds to traditionally to build the housing, to construct the housing, although the current generation of 202 does rely on a lot of leveraging, so bringing in other resources besides 202 money to build. And then the 202 program also provides that ongoing operating subsidy to bridge the gap between what residents pay toward rent, regardless of their income. Residents pay about 30% of their income for rent, and what it actually costs the nonprofit owner, they're all nonprofits who participate in 202 and 811, to actually run quality housing. And built into those operating costs are also funds for a service coordinator. the 202 program gets renewed every year by Congress. There's about 400,000 units of Section 202 homes across the country. But in about 2010, 2011, Congress stopped funding new Section 202 units when the Obama administration said that they were really interested in redeveloping the 202 program, reimagining it. And let's hit pause for a second, and we'll come back to you with a better 202 program. And several years later, amidst the budget caps, that never happened. And in 2017, Congress said enough. There's a severe shortage. We're seeing homelessness among older adults. Let's get the 202 program back to building new housing. And between 2017 and the FY20 appropriations bill, Congress appropriated, I think, about $251 million for new 202 homes. And as of this moment, HUD has released only $50 million of those that money. Now, $250 million over a few years pales in comparison to what the 202 program was funded for decades before 2010. You know, we were talking $500, $600, $700 million a year for new 202 homes. But we've got these sort of first steps, bits and pieces over the last few years, which we desperately need to house more people. And, you know, we understood from HUD that the next round of 202 money after the $50 million would take a little longer because they were giving nonprofits time to get their leveraging ducks in order so that they would be successful in their leveraging parts of the notice of funding availability. But, you know, we've been told now for a year that the NOFA would be out soon. And then we have very unconfirmed and from a HUD staff, not at headquarters, that the amount that will come out in the next NOFA, whenever that is, won't even be the balance of the funds available, that it will be some share of that. There does seem to be some hesitancy at HUD to getting these resources out. I don't know if it's paperwork. HUD did this year request an increase in the 202 program. They wanted money for new construction. In previous years, that wasn't the case. This, you know, we are, and there's language in the House Appropriations report this year that urges HUD to get those dollars out as quickly as possible. But with waiting lists so long, with homelessness rampant, with the need so great, we are desperate to get those units built. So I'll pass it over to Sara.
So from long years of experience working at HUD, my answer is an oversight hearing quickly. I am not privy to any insider information about what's holding HUD up on this. I know that there was a reimagining of the 202 program as people were interfacing the need for housing with the idea that they should be moving in an Olmsted kind of way to more integrated settings for people. And you know, people were trying to figure out how to balance those two experiences. 202 housing serves people with 3 defined disability terms and seniors. And it can serve one of those groups or 2 of those groups or all 4 of those groups. So it's a limited population. I think many people think that a 202 program that serves large numbers of people in one place is not necessarily the best solution because many people know 202s that turn into a more of a warehouse setting. But I think that what HUD's thinking is right now is not known to me. And it doesn't sound like it's known to Linda either. And so I think my thinking about this is to have the discussion about it with the question of how is HUD going to increase accessible housing in its programs? How is HUD going to ensure accessibility in its CDBG and in block grant programs and home programs? And what is HUD going to do about the 202 program? And what is its vision for that, considering the need on one hand and the Olmsted issues about not housing too many people with disabilities all in the same place? I mean, there's many perspectives on that, and it would be worthwhile, I think, to have a good airing of those subjects.
Well, I really appreciate that. And, we've had Secretary Carson appear before this committee, but it's been quite some time since he did. And I'm hopeful that he can come back before the committee so that we can ask him about this issue, and perhaps have some of the deputy undersecretaries appear as well. So I appreciate your encouragement, but, clearly this is a program that was allowed to wither. Congress made the decision to appropriate money, and then to have it not be spent even as they're asking for more appropriations, I think is sort of a senseless to me. I wanted to ask a question of you, Ms. Pratt, and then have Ms. Donald follow up. You mentioned that there's a requirement for in the Fair Housing Act that multifamily housing should have a portion of it be accessible, and that you mentioned 2 cities, I think Chicago and LA, who have taken funds from the federal government to build multifamily housing, but have failed to comply, at least in your opinion, with the accessibility requirement. I wonder if you could help our audience and me and the members understand, how does this happen? Is the requirement unclear? Is there not sufficient enforcement during the building process? How can we fix this so that you're not on the back end trying to sue to deal with it?
What a great question. So I'll start with these answers. The Fair Housing Act, when it was amended in 1988, said that every newly constructed multifamily housing property, apartments, condos, market rate or affordable, had to comply with the Fair Housing Act's accessibility requirements. It is not a high level of accessibility, but it covers a large number of units. If the building has an elevator, every single unit is covered. You got to have flat entrances, wider doors, a little more space in the bathrooms and the kitchens, be able to get out the patio door to your balcony, right? And if the building doesn't have an elevator, all of the ground floor units, the same thing. So this is not a high level of accessibility. Now, but it applies to every kind of housing that you're building that has 4 or more units in the building. Then layer on top of that, the Section 504, which applies to federally funded buildings. And with federally funded buildings, at least 5% of the newly constructed units have to have a high level of accessibility. They have to have grab bars. They have to have accessible stoves and kitchens that you can move around easily. And that Section 504 has been around. That has regulations were dated 1989. So you would think is not a surprise to anybody. And yet, when this money has gone to cities and the cities give out the money for building housing, community development block grant money and home money, they do not tell the developers that they have to do the accessibility issues as part of their planning for construction. And then the city fills out forms to HUD and says, "Dear HUD, look how many accessible units we've built." And our investigations have shown that those statements to the government for taxpayer money are lies. They are not true. And there is a major False Claims Act case, has been for many years, against the city of Los Angeles for building housing with federal dollars that are not accessible. Same sort of thing in Chicago. And it's that not that the law is unclear. It is that the city, when it's giving developers its money, is not saying part of our obligation to the federal government is you, Mr. Developer, have to make this property comply with Fair Housing Act and Section 504. And unfortunately, that's common.
Has the Inspector General ever done an investigation of this, the HUD Inspector General?
Not to my knowledge. The Department of Justice is aware of it. My office, when I was at HUD, was aware of it because we investigated it case by case. But there are more than 2 cities in this country that have been doing this, and it is abuse of the community development block grant funds and the home funds that go to states and to cities, that the developers who are building these properties are not complying with well-established laws.
Well, thank you very much. I'm definitely going to follow up on that. I wanted to close by turning to Ms. Donald. As we celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, how can we think in a forward way about what kinds of disabilities we ought to be building for? We talked a lot about sort of physical disability accommodation, right? Wider doors, bathrooms, kitchen accessibility. But when we think about disability, we also are including people who may have cognitive issues. We think about the senior population, particularly, who may have disabilities related to Alzheimer's or dementia, those who may have mental health disabilities. Can you talk a little bit about where the most acute shortages are? And I take it from you that there are a lack of affordable and accessible housing for the disability community across the board. But I'd love to hear your thoughts about how we might need to reimagine what it means to be a person with disability as we think about building housing and providing supportive services streams to go with it. You might be on mute, Ms. Donald.
I apologize about that. I think it's critically important that for this committee to recognize that oftentimes when these new developments pop up, they're tied to economic reinvestment into, economically depressed communities. And one thing I would like to see is that more people with different types of disability are brought into this conversation, because understanding accessibility comes with understanding that not all disabilities are the same, and understanding that the accessibility needs of people with disabilities are not all the same. You can have a store, you can have an apartment with a no-step entrance, but if inside the construction, inside the house or the apartment, if the bathtub is too high in the new construction, that is a piece of accessibility that, the bathroom, then, even though the bathroom doors are wide enough, then the bathroom is still inaccessible for a person who has a motor disability or motor skills are affected. It's about reimagining the way that you think about housing. Instead of making the house accessible on the back end, make it accessible on the front end. I was in St. Louis and I visited this beautiful place, the St. Louis Center for Independent Living, and they had an entire team dedicated to reimagining living spaces and what it looks like to actually age in place and be comfortable in your environment. It could be something as simple as lowering a light switch and educating developers to know that when you add accessibility features to your home, you are saving money on the front end. You are including people who would otherwise not have the access to homes. And one thing that I think is often left out of the conversation in terms of, reimagining housing and the way you think about housing, when you build a new construction like a townhome is a structure that is not federally mandated to be accessible. So when you see these new constructions pop up, they're often townhomes, and that is one way that these developers get around actually providing accessibility. Or you also have a lot of times where developers, they may buy a piece of property where there's 30 or 40 units and only 2 of those units are made to be accessible. But if they took a wider view at it and saw that if I just added a grab bar here or put a ramp outside, or made sure that the accessibility standards of what it takes for a person to actually live with a disability are actually followed, then we could avoid a lot of the back and forth that often happens when a person encounters a place that they want to live that is not accessible for them.
If I could just add to that, in addition to the accessibility features that are minimum standards for access, what I hear Allison's talking about is the fact that for many people, accessibility relates to the particular disability related needs of the individual. That's harder to legislate. So, but it's important, right? And so you need compliance with the minimums across the board so that you have lots of opportunity for maximizing usability. And then you have a system in place on top of that that meets the needs of particular people with disabilities. The person who needs a special grab bar or needs a roll-in shower instead of a bathtub.
No, and I think this follows up what Ms. Donald said about the townhomes. I think really dovetails what you recognized in your testimony, Ms. Pratt, about single family and the need to make sure that people who are people with disabilities don't have to live in multifamily, that they have a range of different living options. And I think one of the things we've seen more and more people with disabilities, marrying, having children, having larger families, and 1 or 2 bedroom apartments don't work for every person with disabilities. And so I take that was a nice compliment with the townhome point and the single family point that you were making, and the need for us to consider a set aside in that regard. I just want to say thank you so much to each one of our witnesses, to Ms. Pratt, to Ms. Couch, to Ms. Donald, and to Ms. Brewer. Thank you so much for joining with us and for all of your work, for helping to educate this committee. I'm grateful to all of the members that were able to join. I also want to recognize we have a very large number of staffers who were listening to this call and are able to take these ideas back with the chairwoman's support to continue working on this problem. So thank you very much for participating, for sharing your expertise, and for being a resource to this committee. With that, we're going to conclude the roundtable.